There is a silent line you can cross with an empath line you won't even see until it's too late. And the moment you cross it, they won't argue, they won't fight, they won't explain, they will simply disappear from your life as if they were never there. The question is, what is that line, and why does crossing it cost you someone who once gave you everything? You see, an empath is not weak. Let's get that straight right now. An empath is one of the strongest beings you will ever encounter because they feel everything and still choose to love. They walk into a room and sense what no one else can sense. They carry emotional weight that most people wouldn't survive for a single day. And yet they give, they care, they show up with their whole heart. But here's the truth most people don't understand. An empath's kindness is not unlimited. It is sacred. And the moment you begin to treat that sacred energy as something ordinary, you begin the process of losing them. Because what makes? An empath's stay is not convenience, it is connection. And what makes them leave is not anger, it is clarity. Let me tell you something powerful. Empaths don't leave when they're hurt the first time. They don't leave the second time either. In fact, they often stay longer than they should, hoping, believing, investing. They see potential where others see problems. They forgive when others would walk away. They give chances when no one else would. But every time you dismiss their feelings, every time you invalidate their emotions, every time you take their presence for granted, you are teaching them a lesson. And that lesson is this: I am not safe here. And once an empath learns that, the shift begins. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, subtly. They start pulling their energy back. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing. They stop trying to fix what you refuse to acknowledge. And one day, without warning, they are gone. No drama, no chaos, just absence. Because an empath understands something deeply spiritual. Where there is no respect, there can be no alignment. And where there is no alignment, there can be no growth. You see, life operates on a principle: what you honor, you keep. What you neglect, you lose. And if you neglect an empath's heart long enough, they won't fight for a place in your life. They will create a better life without you. Now here's the deeper truth: this isn't just about relationships. This is about energy. Every human being is an energetic field, and empaths are highly sensitive to that field. When your actions don't match your words, they feel it. When your intentions are not pure, they sense it. When your presence becomes draining instead of nourishing, they absorb it. And eventually they make a decision not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Because at some point, an empath realizes, I deserve the same depth I give. That realization is powerful. It's life-changing. And once they reach it, there is no going back. So if you ever find yourself with an empath in your life, understand this: don't test their limits. Don't play games with their heart. Don't assume they will always be there just because they have been. Instead, meet them where they are. Honor their presence. Speak truth. Show consistency. Because when you do that, you don't just keep an empath, you elevate your own life. And if you don't, you won't get a second chance to wonder why they disappeared, because by then they've already chosen peace over pain, growth over attachment, and truth over illusion. And that is a decision they never regret. An empath does not enter your life casually. They arrive with awareness, with sensitivity, and with an unspoken intention to connect on a level most people never even attempt. For them, emotional safety is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, nothing meaningful can survive. And the moment that safety is compromised, shifts deep inside them something that no words, no apologies, no temporary changes can easily repair. You have to understand, an empath is constantly absorbing the emotional environment around them. They don't just hear your words, they feel the energy behind them. They notice the subtle change in your tone, the inconsistency in your behavior, the tension you try to hide. While others may overlook these details, an empath processes them instantly. And when those signals begin to contradict trust, respect, and care, their nervous system goes into protection mode. At first, they may not say anything. They will observe. They will try to understand. They will give you the benefit of the doubt because that is who they are. They lead with compassion. But every time you dismiss their feelings, you're not only hurting their feelings, you're also hurting your own. Every time you make them feel like they are too much, every time you ignore the emotional signals they are trying to communicate, you are slowly dismantling the sense of safety they need to stay connected. And here's where most people get it wrong. They think emotional safety is about avoiding conflict. It's not. An empath can handle truth. They can handle honesty. What they cannot handle is emotional unpredictability, manipulation, or being made to feel like their inner world is invalid. The moment they feel like they have to shrink themselves to maintain the relationship, the connection begins to die. Because for an empath, love without safety is not love at all. It's survival. Now think about this. When someone who gives so deeply begins to feel unsafe, they don't explode, they withdraw. They start protecting their energy in ways you might not even notice at first. They become quieter, more reserved, less expressive. It's not because they have nothing to say, it's because they no longer feel it is safe to say it. And that silence is not emptiness, it is a decision forming. Every human being has a threshold, and an empath's threshold is not measured by how much they can endure, but by how long they can stay disconnected from their own truth. Once that line is crossed, once they realize that staying means abandoning themselves, everything changes. They begin to detach not out of anger, but out of alignment. They start choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion. And when they finally walk away, it won't come with a dramatic explanation. It will come with a calm certainty that they deserve better than what they've been experiencing. This is why betraying an empath's emotional safety is so powerful. It doesn't just hurt them in the moment. It reshapes how they see the entire connection. Trust, once broken at that level, is not easily rebuilt because it's not about a single action. It's about a pattern that made them feel unprotected in a space where they chose to be vulnerable. And vulnerability for an empath is sacred. So when that sacred space is violated, they don't just lose trust in you, they lose the reason to stay. And once that reason is gone, no amount of words can replace the feeling they needed but didn't receive. That's the moment they begin to disappear, not physically at first, but emotionally. And by the time you notice their absence, they have already made peace with leaving because they understand something most people don't. Protecting your inner world is not selfish, it is necessary. There's a breaking point that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no sudden exit, no emotional explosion. It looks like patience until it isn't. And when it comes to consistent disrespect, that breaking point arrives much sooner than people expect. Because what you're really doing is slowly draining the very energy that keeps an empath connected to you. An empath doesn't measure a relationship by grand gestures. They measure it by patterns, the small moments, the tone in your voice, the way you respond when they open up, the respect you show not just when it's convenient, but when it actually requires effort. And when those moments begin to carry a pattern of dismissal, sarcasm, neglect, or disregard, it doesn't just hurt them, it exhausts them. At first, they try to adjust. They tell themselves, maybe you didn't mean it that way. Maybe you're going through something. Maybe if they show more understanding, more patience, more care, things will shift. And so they give more. They soften their approach. They try to communicate in a way that preserves the connection. But here's the truth: when disrespect becomes consistent, it stops being accidental. It becomes a signal, a message that says, this is what you are worth in this space. And an empath hears that message loud and clear, even when it's never spoken directly. And the problem is not just the disrespect itself, it's the repetition. Because every repeated act of disrespect chips away at something deeper, their sense of emotional security, their willingness to invest, their desire to stay open. What once felt like connection starts to feel like depletion. You see, an empath gives from a place of abundance, but they are not an endless source. They are deeply connected to energy, and when that energy is not replenished with appreciation, kindness, and mutual respect, it begins to run dry. And once that happens, they don't become angry, they become distant. That distance is not punishment, it's preservation. Because at some point, an empath recognizes a powerful truth. You cannot keep pouring into a space that continuously empties you. You cannot keep offering respect to someone who consistently shows you the opposite. And you cannot keep abandoning yourself just to maintain a connection that no longer honors who you are. So they start to pull back, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that restores balance within themselves. They stop overextending. They stop tolerating behavior they once excused. They begin to observe instead of engage. And here's what most people miss: this is the moment. Everything can still change. This is the moment where awareness, accountability, and genuine effort could rebuild what's been damaged. But if the pattern of disrespect continues, if nothing shifts, if nothing is acknowledged, then that quiet distance becomes permanent. Because once an empath chooses self-respect, they don't go back to self-abandonment. And when they finally walk away, it won't feel sudden to them. It will feel overdue. It will feel like the natural result of everything they've been experiencing for far too long. While others may see it as an unexpected disappearance for them, it is the final step in a process that began the moment respect was no longer present. This is why consistent disrespect is so destructive. It doesn't just create conflict, it erodes connection at its core. It turns something that once felt safe into something that feels heavy, draining, and misaligned. And once that shift happens, an empath will not fight to hold on to what is slowly breaking. They will choose themselves, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally cared enough about their own well-being to stop accepting less than they deserve. There's something uniquely damaging about emotional manipulation when it's directed at an empath, because you're not just distorting facts or distorting their inner reality. And for someone who already feels deeply and processes everything on an emotional level, that kind of distortion cuts far deeper than most people realize. It doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes. An empath approaches relationships with openness. They listen, they try to understand, they naturally put themselves in the other person's position. That's part of their strength, but it also makes them vulnerable to manipulation tactics like guilt tripping, gaslighting, or subtle emotional pressure. Because when you tell an empath, you're overreacting or you're the problem, they don't immediately reject that idea. They reflect on it. They question themselves. They search for where they might have gone wrong. And that's where the damage begins. Because manipulation thrives on self-doubt. The more an empath starts doubting their own feelings, the easier it becomes to control the narrative. They begin to suppress what they feel just to keep the peace. They begin to carry guilt that was never theirs to begin with. They start adjusting their behavior, not out of growth, but out of fear of being blamed again. But here's the truth and on. Empath can only live in that space for so long. At some point, something inside them starts to wake up. It may be subtle at first, a moment where they realize this doesn't feel right. A situation where the same pattern repeats again and again, no matter how much they try to fix it. And slowly, they begin to see the pattern not as isolated incidents, but as a system of control. They start connecting the dots. They realize that every time they tried to express a need, it was turned back on them. Every time they set a boundary, it was met with guilt. Every time they sought clarity, they were met with confusion. And that realization is powerful because it shifts them from self-doubt to self-awareness. Once that shift happens, everything changes. Because an empath who becomes aware of manipulation is no longer easily controlled. They begin to trust their feelings again. They start listening to their intuition instead of dismissing it. And most importantly, they recognize that love should never feel like a constant negotiation of their own worth. And this is where trust breaks in a way that is incredibly difficult to repair. Because manipulation doesn't just create panic, it creates a sense of betrayal at the deepest level. It tells the empath, the person I trusted with my vulnerability used it against me. And once that realization settles in, the connection is fundamentally altered. They may not confront you immediately. They may not expose everything they've understood. But internally, a decision is forming. A decision to no longer participate in something that requires them to abandon their truth. And when an empath reaches that point, they don't argue to win. They don't try to prove you wrong. They simply disengage. Because they understand something that most people overlook. You cannot build a healthy connection on a foundation of manipulation. No amount of words, promises, or temporary changes can restore what was broken unless there is genuine accountability and change. And if that is missing, staying becomes a form of self-betrayal. So they choose differently. They choose clarity over confusion, peace over emotional chaos, truth over control. And when they walk away, it's not impulsive, it's intentional. It's the result of seeing things clearly after a long period of distortion. It's the moment they reclaim their voice, their perception, and their sense of self. That's why emotional manipulation is one of the fastest ways to lose an empath knot. Because they are weak, but because once they see through it, they will never allow themselves to be trapped in it again. There's a quiet imbalance that can exist in relationships that doesn't show up in obvious ways at first. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It builds slowly through patterns of giving on one side and taking on the other. And when that imbalance continues unchecked, it creates a kind of emotional debt that an empath eventually refuses to keep paying. An empath is naturally generous. They give their time, their attention, their energy, their presence. They listen when others don't. They show up when it's inconvenient. They invest emotionally in ways that go far beyond surface level connection. And the truth is, they don't give with the expectation of constant return. They give because it's who they are. But here's what many people misunderstand. Giving without expectation does not mean accepting without limit. Because even the most giving person in the world needs reciprocity, not necessarily in identical form, but in meaningful effort, in acknowledgement, in presence, in care that reflects back some portion of what has been given. When that reflection is missing, when one person continuously takes while the other continuously gives, the relationship begins to shift from connection into consumption. And an empath feels that shift deeply. At first, they may not label it as imbalance. They may tell themselves that people express care differently, that maybe the other person struggles to show up in the same way. And so they compensate. They give more. They stretch further. They try to fill the gaps with their own energy, hoping it will eventually create harmony. But instead of creating balance, it creates depletion. Because every time they give without receiving anything meaningful in return, a part of them begins to feel unseen. Not necessarily unloved in words, but unvalued in action. And for an empath, actions carry far more weight than promises or intentions. Over time, this dynamic becomes exhausting, not physically, but emotionally. It starts to feel like they are the only one holding the connection together, the only one investing, the only one trying to maintain something that should be shared. And this is where the internal conflict begins. Because an empath doesn't want to stop giving, it goes against their nature. But at the same time, they begin to recognize that continuing to give in a one-sided dynamic is not kindness. Anymore, it's self-neglect. It's pouring energy into a space that does not replenish them and slowly losing themselves in the process. That realization is uncomfortable, but it is also transformative. Because once an empath sees the imbalance clearly, they cannot unsee it. They start asking deeper questions. Why am I the only one trying? Why does this feel so heavy? Why do I feel empty after giving so much? And those questions lead them to a powerful truth. Connection should not feel like a constant sacrifice of self. So they begin to shift not dramatically, not all at once, but intentionally. They pull back their energy. They stop overextending. They allow space to see what happens when they are no longer the one carrying everything. And what happens next reveals everything. If the other person steps up, acknowledges the imbalance, and begins to contribute in a genuine way, there is room for rebuilding. But if nothing changes, if the pattern continues, if the taking persists, without awareness or effort, then the empath understands something clearly. They are not in a relationship. They are in an extraction. And once that truth settles in, staying no longer feels right. Because an empath may give freely, but they will not stay where they are consistently drained. They will not continue investing in a space that treats their energy as something to consume rather than something to honor. So they choose differently. They choose balance. They choose mutual effort. They choose connections where giving and receiving exist in harmony, not as a transaction, but as a natural flow. And when they walk away from imbalance, it's not because they stop caring, it's because they finally recognize that caring should never cost them their entire sense of self. There's a moment in every empath's life when they begin to understand the true purpose of boundaries. Not as walls to shut people out, but as standards that protect what matters most within them. And when those boundaries are ignored repeatedly, casually, or deliberately, it sends a message that goes far beyond the surface. It tells them your limits don't matter here. And that message is something an empath will not accept forever. In the beginning, an empath's boundaries are often soft. Not because they don't have them, but because they genuinely want to create connection, not restriction. They give people space. They allow room for mistakes. They try to communicate rather than control. When it bothers them, they may express it gently, hoping the other person understands without needing to be pushed. But here's the reality: boundaries only work when they are respected. And when someone continuously crosses those lines, whether it's by dismissing their needs, invading their emotional space, then it's time to take a stand and say, enough is enough, or pushing them into situations that feel uncomfortable, the empath begins to feel something deeper than irritation. They begin to feel unseen. Not just misunderstood, but unacknowledged at a fundamental level. Because a boundary is not just a preference. It is a reflection of self-respect. So when that boundary is ignored, what the empath experiences is not just inconvenience, it is a direct challenge to their sense of worth within the relationship. It raises a powerful internal question. If this person truly values me, why do they keep disregarding what I've clearly expressed? At first, they may repeat themselves. They may try to explain more clearly. They may even adjust their expectations, hoping that with more patience, the other person will finally understand. But every repeated violation without change begins to erode something inside them. It creates emotional fatigue because now, instead of feeling safe to be themselves, they feel like they have to constantly defend their space. And that is not connection, that is tension. That is a dynamic where they are forced to protect themselves instead of simply existing in trust. And over time, that tension becomes unbearable because an empath is not designed to live in a state of constant defense. They are designed to flow, to connect, to feel freely. But when boundaries are ignored, that flow is disrupted. It becomes guarded, restricted, controlled. And this is where the shift begins. The empath starts to realize that explaining themselves over and over is not the solution. That being more patient is not creating change. That giving more chances is not leading to more respect. Instead, they begin to understand something far more powerful. If someone truly values you, they don't need to be convinced to respect your boundaries, they choose to. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath sees that the issue is not misunderstanding but lack of regard, they stop trying to fix it. They stop negotiating their own needs. They stop lowering their standards to maintain the connection. They become still. And in that stillness, a decision forms not out of anger but out of clarity. They begin to withdraw their energy from spaces where they are not respected. They stop engaging in conversations that dismiss their limits. They stop showing up in ways that require them to sacrifice their own comfort just to keep someone else satisfied. And when they reach that point, leaving is no longer difficult because staying would mean continuing to accept a reality where their voice does not matter. And for an empath who is awakened to their own worth, that is not an option. So they walk away, not to punish, not to prove a point, but to realign with themselves. Because they understand something deeply transformative. Boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about choosing where you belong. And if someone repeatedly shows that they cannot honor those boundaries, they are also showing that they cannot hold a place in your life. And once that truth is clear, the empath does not need to argue, explain, or justify their departure. They simply honor themselves and move on. There's something an empath seeks that goes far beyond surface level interaction. It's not just conversation, not just presence, not just shared time, it's truth, depth, realness. They are drawn to what is genuine in a world that often rewards performance. And when that authenticity is missing, when what they feel doesn't match what they see, something inside them begins to disconnect. An empath has an almost instinctive ability to sense when something is off. You can say all the right words, play all the right roles, present yourself in a way that looks perfect from the outside, but if it's not real, they will feel it. Not logically at first, but emotionally. It shows up as a subtle discomfort, a quiet confusion, a sense that something isn't aligning. And they don't ignore that feeling. At the beginning, they may try to understand it. They may give you space to open up. They may believe that maybe you're just guarded. Maybe you've been hurt. Maybe authenticity will come with time. And because they value depth so deeply, they are willing to be patient. They are willing to meet you halfway. They are willing to create a space where truth can exist safely. But authenticity cannot be forced. It has to be chosen. And when someone consistently chooses to hide behind masks, to avoid vulnerability, to present a version of themselves that is curated instead of real, it creates a barrier that an empath cannot cross. Because connection for them is not built on appearances, it is built on truth. So when they feel that what you show is not what you are, they begin to pull back not out of judgment, but out of misalignment. Because to an empath, being around inauthentic energy feels draining. It requires them to constantly filter, to question, to navigate something that doesn't feel stable. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not because they expect perfection, but because they need honesty. They don't need you to have everything figured out. They don't need you to be flawless. In fact, they are far more drawn to imperfection than perfection because imperfection is real. What they cannot connect with is pretense, a version of you that is designed to impress rather than express. And this is where many people lose an empath without even realizing it, because they think everything is fine. There's no conflict, no arguments, no obvious issues. But what they don't see is the emotional distance that has already begun. The empath is no longer fully present. They are no longer investing in the same way. They are observing more than engaging. And the reason is simple: they no longer feel a true connection. Because authenticity is the bridge that allows an empath to step into someone else's world. Without it, there is no depth, no trust, no real understanding. Just surface level interaction that feels empty no matter how consistent it may appear. And eventually, the empath reaches a point where they ask themselves a powerful question: can I truly be myself? Here, if the answer is no, if they feel like they have to filter their thoughts, hold back their emotions, or adjust their presence to match something that isn't real, they begin to withdraw. Not dramatically, not suddenly at all, but intentionally. Because they understand that staying in a space without authenticity requires them to disconnect from their own truth. And that is something they will not do for long. So they start choosing environments, relationships, and people where they can be fully seen and fully real. Where honesty is not avoided but embraced. Where vulnerability is not judged but respected. And when they leave inauthenticity behind, it's not because they didn't care, it's because they care too much about living in truth. Because for an empath, connection without authenticity is not connection at all. It's an illusion. And once they see through that illusion, they don't try to fix it. They simply walk away and align themselves with something real. Thank you for listening. Allowing these words to reach your heart, may you choose truth, respect, and growth in every connection. Goodbye for now, and remember, protect your energy, honor your worth, and never settle for less than what aligns with your soul.